Mia moved through the city streets with the same sense of despair she'd grown accustomed to over the past few months. The pavement beneath her feet felt harder than usual today, each step reminding her that she was still alive, yet barely surviving. Her clothes clung to her body, too thin and worn to provide any protection from the harsh winds of the late autumn evening. She could hardly remember the last time she had a good night's sleep. The days and nights blended together, one constant struggle for survival. The weight of her pregnancy only made everything harder to bear, each step feeling like a reminder of the life growing inside her. Life that was both a blessing and a burden she wasn't sure how to carry. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, trying to shield herself from the cold, but the chill that ran through her bones went deeper than the weather. It was the feeling of abandonment, of being invisible, of being discarded by a world she no longer felt a part of. She found herself drawn to a corner of the alleyway, hoping for some kind of sanctuary for just a few hours, even if it was only a place to sit and rest. But even there, the fear of someone finding her, of being vulnerable in a place where she couldn't afford to be, held her back. Mia's thoughts, as always, turned to the baby. She wasn't sure if it was the pregnancy or the constant pressure of her circumstances that left her feeling both trapped and lost. She had tried to reach out for help once, but the moment she tried to talk about it, the fear gripped her. Fear of rejection, of being judged, of being seen as just another case. She had heard whispers of what people thought of women like her, women who were pregnant and homeless. They didn't need help. They needed to be fixed. No one saw her as a person anymore, not someone with dreams or a future. Her decision to keep the pregnancy a secret from everyone, even from potential sources of help, was her way of protecting herself. If they knew, they would see her as even more of a burden than she already was. The shame, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of being trapped in a situation she never asked for, all of it tore at her. She closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the cold wall, trying to breathe through the panic rising in her chest. Memories from the past flashed through her mind, of the abusive relationship that had led her here, to this lonely place, and the scars it had left behind. She hadn't known how to escape it at the time, and now she wasn't sure how to escape this. Would she ever be able to move forward? Would anyone ever love her and the life she carried? Or was she destined to be alone forever? Mia spent another sleepless night in the alley, curled into herself for what little warmth she could muster. As the morning light began to filter through the cracks in the buildings, she rose to her feet and moved toward a nearby diner, hoping to at least get a cup of coffee. The air was colder now, but her body had grown numb to the discomfort. She had learned to navigate the harshness of the streets, to survive, but not to live. Each step toward the diner felt heavier than the last, as though every inch of the world was conspiring to remind her how far removed she was from the life she had once dreamed of. She tried not to think about the future, but the thought always crept in. The fear of rejection, of being turned away yet again, weighed on her more than the physical fatigue. She'd been to countless places looking for work, always leaving with a sense of failure. She'd learned to keep her head down, to avoid making waves, but it had only led to more rejection. No one had ever been willing to give her a chance, not when they saw her scruffy, pregnant, and alone. When she reached the diner, she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the bustle inside. She felt like an intruder in a world that was never meant for her. She could see people sitting comfortably at the counter, having their morning coffee, talking as if their lives were simple, easy. But for Mia, nothing felt easy anymore. She finally stepped inside, and the bell above the door jingled as she walked toward the counter. The server gave her a quick glance, as though sizing her up, before going back to wiping down the counter. Mia ordered the coffee, keeping her voice low, hoping to stay invisible. But her heart pounded as she waited, every second feeling like an eternity. She needed something to change, anything. She needed to feel like she wasn't just fading away into the background of this city. As the minutes passed, she found herself lost in thought, her eyes drifting toward the street outside. The world continued to move on, unaffected by her existence. Then, just as she was about to take her cup of coffee, a voice interrupted her, an unfamiliar voice that broke through the fog of her thoughts. "Excuse me." Mia turned, surprised to find a man standing there, his presence commanding despite the calm expression on his face. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his appearance striking in a way that felt almost out of place in this part of town. He looked at her with an intensity that startled her, and for a moment, Mia thought he might be like the others, someone who would look through her, as if she wasn't even there. But then something in his gaze shifted. He wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing her. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was seeing her, and the weight of that simple act of recognition made her feel exposed. The man's name was Damien Carter, and as he spoke to her, Mia found herself trapped in a strange mix of disbelief and cautious hope. He asked her a few questions, nothing too personal, but enough to make her uncomfortable. It was hard to trust someone who seemed so perfect, so far removed from her world of pain and struggle. But Damien wasn't just asking questions. He was offering something. He made a suggestion that stopped her cold, something so unexpected it left her speechless. He offered her a deal. She could work as his personal assistant for a year, with housing and a stable income, in exchange for helping him improve his company's public image. Mia stood frozen, unable to process what he was saying. It didn't make sense. Why would someone like him, a CEO in a high-rise building, offer her, a homeless pregnant woman, a deal like that? Was this some kind of charity? Was it another trick? Or was it something else entirely? She felt the impulse to turn him down immediately, but something inside her held her back. The prospect of safety, of security, was too tempting. She was desperate. Yet, even in her desperation, there was a part of her that resisted, that couldn't shake the fear of trusting someone again. What did he want from her? Was he using her like everyone else had before? Damien seemed to sense her hesitation. He didn't press her, but he made it clear that he was offering her an opportunity, a chance to change her life. Mia knew it was a turning point, but could she take it? Would she take it? Her mind raced with conflicting emotions. Her pride told her to refuse, to keep fighting on her own. But her reality told her that she had nowhere else to turn. If she didn't take this chance, where would she end up? The streets, the dangers, the loneliness, the fear, it would all still be there, wearing her down day by day. In that moment, the tension between her pride and her desperation was unbearable. She stared at Damien, searching his face for any hint of a hidden agenda. But all she saw was something that looked genuine. His offer wasn't charity. It was something else, an offer to change her life. Mia knew she couldn't let fear rule her any longer. If she wanted to have any hope for herself and her baby, she had to take this chance. After what felt like an eternity, Mia nodded, a hesitant but resolute decision settling within her. "I'll do it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And with that, a door opened. A door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through, but one that she couldn't afford to ignore. Damien had not expected to see Mia again. He had barely thought about their fleeting encounter outside the diner, brushing it off as another random moment in a world where he was far too busy to pay attention to every stray face. But as he volunteered at the local outreach program, something pulled his gaze toward her once more. She was there, sitting quietly at a corner table, her posture defeated, yet there was something about her that felt both familiar and unfamiliar. He had thought he knew the struggle of the underprivileged, the endless cycle of working too hard and never catching a break, but seeing Mia in this setting was different. She didn't look like someone seeking charity. She looked like someone who had been stripped of all dignity and still fought to hold on to what little remained. Damien felt a pang of guilt as he watched her, realizing that perhaps his earlier judgment had been misplaced. He had offered her a chance, but had he truly seen her? Or had he only seen what he thought she represented? Damien approached her cautiously, not wanting to intrude, but the impulse to connect with her, to offer something more than the cold distance of his usual charity, was too strong. As he reached the table, he could see the wariness in her eyes, cautious, guarded, yet with a faint flicker of recognition. She had seen him before, of course, but that didn't mean she trusted him. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. He could offer help, but was it really help or just another form of control? He didn't know the answer, but he knew that he couldn't let her slip away again without at least trying. The tension between them was thick, unspoken, and fragile. He opened his mouth to speak, unsure of how to start, but she was already looking at him, eyes full of skepticism and fear, yet there was a flicker of something else too, something deeper. "I remember you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Damien nodded, his chest tightening. "I've been thinking about you. I don't know if what I offered before made sense, but I want to extend the offer again. This time, with more intention. I want to help you, more than just offering you charity. I think you deserve more than that." Her expression faltered for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Damien could feel her hesitation radiating off her, but he didn't back down. He wasn't offering a handout. He was offering a chance. A real chance. "I'm willing to make you my personal assistant for a year. You'll have stable housing, an income, and I'll help you find a way out of this." He motioned to the room, to her worn clothes, to the life she had clearly been trapped in for far too long. The words hung between them. Damien had been rehearsing this offer in his mind for days, unsure if she would see it as an opportunity or an imposition. He had no illusions. He knew he was offering something that seemed too good to be true, but he also knew he couldn't let her slip through his fingers again. "I'm not asking for anything in return, just your help with improving my company's public image. It's not much, but it could give you something: stability, a future." Mia's eyes narrowed, and her posture stiffened as she processed his words. The proposal was tempting, more tempting than anything she had experienced in a long time. Stability, security, a future for her baby. All the things she had desperately longed for. But could she trust him? Could she trust anyone after everything she had been through? The painful memories of betrayal, of being discarded, flooded her mind. She had been vulnerable before, had opened up to people she thought she could trust, only to be burned. Her instincts screamed at her to turn him down, to refuse to become reliant on a man who could just as easily tear her down again. She could hear the whispers of her past telling her that men like him, men with power, with wealth, always had an agenda. They never gave without expecting something in return. "I'm not sure what you want from me," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the doubt that churned inside her. Damien's face softened. "I'm not asking for anything other than your time. And I think you deserve better than what you've been given. I think we could help each other." But Mia's heart twisted with conflicting emotions. Her pride, her fiercely independent spirit, screamed at her to refuse. But the practical side of her, the side that was worn down by weeks on the streets, by hunger and desperation, was telling her that this might be her only chance. A chance for a life not defined by survival, but by choice. She had no way of knowing what Damien's true motivations were. But for once, she wondered if she could take a step towards something better. She didn't trust him, not entirely, but she was desperate. And sometimes, desperation led people to make choices they wouldn't otherwise consider. Her eyes flitted away from his, as if searching for some sign that this was a mistake, that she was wrong to even entertain the idea. But all she saw was her own reflection, tired, broken, uncertain. The idea of a future with stability, of not having to worry about where she would sleep or how she would feed herself or her child, was too much to ignore. And for the first time, the idea of accepting help didn't feel like an insult to her dignity. It felt like a lifeline. "I don't know," Mia whispered, the words heavy with the weight of her internal struggle. "I'm afraid. I don't want to owe you anything." Damien nodded, understanding the fear that clouded her mind. "You won't owe me anything. This is your chance. If you want it." A long pause stretched between them as Mia's mind raced, her thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. The prospect of security, of a chance to build something for herself and her baby, was too much to ignore. The fear of what might happen if she said no, if she stayed stuck in the same hopeless cycle, was worse than the fear of trusting him. Slowly, with a deep breath, Mia nodded. "I'll take it." The words were reluctant, but they were said. Damien exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. "You won't regret it." Her heart was still heavy with doubt, but for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of something else, something that felt like hope. Mia's new life began in the blink of an eye, though she could hardly comprehend the weight of it at first. The penthouse apartment Damien had arranged for her was nothing like anything she had ever imagined. It was sleek, pristine, filled with luxuries she had only seen on the glossy pages of magazines. Furniture that looked too expensive to touch, windows that opened to sweeping views of the city, and a bed that seemed to promise comfort beyond anything she had ever known. Yet, as she stepped inside, the foreignness of it all made her feel like an imposter. The plush surroundings felt like a world she had no right to be a part of, and a sense of guilt flooded over her. Mia stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the stark contrast between the luxury of her new life and the harsh reality of the streets she had known for so long. Her bare feet sank into the thick carpet, and she stared at the clothes hanging in the closet, designer pieces she had never touched, let alone owned. It felt wrong, almost shameful, to be here. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. How could she deserve this? How could anyone like her deserve such comfort after living a life of pain and survival? As she paced around the apartment, she found herself gravitating toward the window, looking out at the glittering cityscape below. For a fleeting moment, it was easy to imagine a different life, one where she wasn't constantly struggling, where she had a future, where her baby could grow up in a world of stability instead of fear. But that vision was quickly shattered as self-doubt crept in. She had fought so hard to survive, to prove she was worthy of her own independence. Now this new life, this opportunity, felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever stood for. The weight of Damien's generosity felt suffocating, as though she was being swallowed whole by a world she didn't understand, a world that didn't truly belong to her. Every inch of the apartment felt too grand for someone like her, and yet it was hers, a place she could call home, at least for now. Damien, meanwhile, didn't seem to notice the unease that was slowly consuming Mia. He had thought that offering her the penthouse would solve everything, that it would provide the security she needed to feel safe, to move forward. But he was beginning to realize that he had underestimated the complexities of Mia's emotional world. She was proud, fiercely independent, and she hadn't yet come to terms with the idea of accepting help without feeling indebted. Damien had always been a man used to control, to power, but he was starting to see that offering something to Mia was never going to be as simple as writing a check or providing a roof over her head. At work, their interactions began to shift. Damien watched as Mia navigated her new role as his personal assistant, her sharp mind and resourcefulness evident in every task she took on. But there was still a tension between them. The power dynamic that existed between them. Him, the wealthy CEO, and her, the woman who had been reduced to nothing more than charity, was impossible to ignore. Mia had yet to fully trust him, still holding her cards close to her chest. She was always polite, always professional, but Damien could sense that she was holding something back. And perhaps, deep down, he understood why. He tried to open up, offering glimpses into his own life, hoping to bridge the distance between them. He spoke of the pressures he faced, the loneliness that gnawed at him despite his professional success. Mia listened, her eyes not quite meeting his, but he could see her trying to make sense of the man standing before her. He wasn't like the others who had come and gone in her life. He didn't feel like someone trying to manipulate her, but that didn't mean he was immune to the power he held over her. And the more he saw her, the more he realized just how much she had endured, how much pain she had buried deep within herself. Their professional relationship deepened into something more personal as the days passed. There were moments of connection, when Mia would share a small piece of her past, or Damien would admit the vulnerabilities that lay beneath his polished exterior. Yet, despite the closeness that seemed to grow between them, there was an undeniable divide, a wall that neither of them knew how to tear down. Damien's growing attraction to Mia made it harder for him to remain distant, but he held back, knowing that he could never cross that line. He didn't know if she wanted him to. Mia, for her part, felt torn between two worlds. On the one hand, she was grateful for the security Damien had given her, for the opportunity to create a better future for her child. But on the other hand, she felt herself becoming more dependent on him, more tied to his world, a world she had spent so long resenting. She began to question whether it was possible to maintain her independence while accepting his help. It wasn't just the lifestyle that bothered her. It was the emotional imbalance between them. He had the power to control her, to determine her future, and despite his kindness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being manipulated, even if it wasn't intentional. In the quiet moments when she allowed herself to think about the future, Mia couldn't help but wonder if she was falling into a trap. What did Damien want from her? Was he truly trying to help? Or was he simply trying to redeem himself through her? And if she accepted his help, would she forever be indebted to him? Would she ever be able to break free, to stand on her own 2 feet again? It wasn't just her pride that stood in the way. It was her deep-rooted belief that she wasn't worthy of this life, that she didn't belong in this world. She still saw herself as the woman on the streets, struggling to survive. The person she had been before this offer, before the penthouse and the designer clothes, was still there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to remind her that this new life wasn't real. But as much as she struggled with these feelings, there were moments when she couldn't ignore the fact that Damien had changed the trajectory of her life. The future, once an endless void of uncertainty, now held a flicker of possibility. She wasn't sure if she could trust Damien, or if she even wanted to, but for the first time in a long time, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Mia's growing discomfort became harder to ignore as the days passed. Though her role at Damien's company began to feel more familiar, the weight of her reliance on him hung over her, casting a long shadow on everything she did. As the months went by, Mia tried to keep a facade of calm, but inside, she was beginning to feel suffocated. The comfort of having a stable income and a safe place to live came with an emotional cost she hadn't anticipated. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to survive and take care of herself. Now, as she settled into this new world of luxury and security, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping further from who she once was. The more she accepted from Damien, the more she questioned whether she would ever regain her self-sufficiency. Would she forever be tied to his generosity, unable to break free from the shadow of his help? Mia couldn't help but feel that every decision she made was now under Damien's influence, that her future, once full of possibility, was now determined by his whims and the contract they had formed. She wanted to believe she could still chart her own course, but the constant reminders of how much she owed him weighed on her. It wasn't just about the apartment or the job. It was the sense of power he held over her. She found herself slipping into moments of self-doubt, wondering if she could ever find her footing again without Damien's support. Could she ever break free from this dependency and prove to herself that she could make it on her own? Or was this her new reality, permanently bound to the man who had taken pity on her? Damien, on the other hand, was facing his own struggles that he kept hidden beneath his calm exterior. His admiration for Mia grew each day, but he remained emotionally distant, afraid of opening up and letting anyone get too close. His past had taught him to build walls, to protect himself from the vulnerabilities of love and attachment. He had never been able to trust anyone fully, least of all someone like Mia, who seemed to challenge everything he thought he knew about power and control. His upbringing had been one of emotional neglect, shaped by a father who never showed affection or approval, and Damien had long since buried those feelings beneath layers of work and ambition. The idea of allowing anyone, especially Mia, to see his true self terrified him. He wasn't ready to face the emotional risks of letting her into his heart, despite the fact that he was drawn to her in ways he didn't fully understand. As Damien's feelings for Mia grew, so did his internal conflict. He wasn't sure if he was falling for her or if he was simply trying to redeem himself through his actions toward her. He had done so much for her, but was it out of genuine care, or was he trying to absolve himself of the guilt that had followed him for years? His workaholic tendencies and emotional detachment were his only ways of coping with the pressures of his family's expectations. But as Mia began to occupy more of his thoughts, he was forced to confront the emptiness that had lingered in his life for so long. The loneliness he had buried beneath his professional success began to surface, and he found himself wondering if it was finally time to allow someone in, or if the fear of vulnerability would forever keep him locked away behind his carefully constructed walls. Things took an unexpected turn when Damien invited Mia to a prestigious charity event, their first public appearance together. The night was glamorous, with flashing cameras and high-profile guests. But beneath the glittering surface, tension simmered. Mia's discomfort was palpable as she navigated the unfamiliar world of luxury and high society. She was keenly aware of her status as an outsider, a charity case who didn't belong in the world Damien had mastered. The situation grew even more complicated when Damien's ex-girlfriend, Clara, made an appearance. Clara was everything Mia was not: polished, composed, and exuding an air of superiority. The moment Clara set her eyes on Mia, it was clear that she wasn't happy to see her there. Her words were laced with sharpness, cutting through the air like a blade. "How does it feel, Mia, to be nothing more than a charity case?" she asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The sting of those words hit Mia harder than she expected. She had always struggled with her sense of self-worth, and Clara's harsh comments only deepened those insecurities. Mia felt the weight of Clara's judgment and immediately began to withdraw emotionally, pulling back from Damien in the process. She feared that Clara's words were true, that she was nothing more than a project to him, a way for him to redeem himself in the eyes of the world. Despite all the kindness Damien had shown her, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was just another notch on his belt, a charity case he could showcase to prove he wasn't like the rest of the wealthy elite. Her sense of self-worth was shaken to its core, and the distance between her and Damien grew that night, as the emotional wound Clara had inflicted festered in her heart. She couldn't help but wonder if Damien's gestures of kindness were born out of guilt, not affection. Damien noticed the shift in Mia immediately. The warmth that had once been present between them seemed to dissipate, replaced by an invisible wall that Mia had built between them. He could feel the tension in her body, the coolness in her demeanor, and it frustrated him. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the cruelty that Clara had unleashed, but his own feelings were a tangled mess. He couldn't bring himself to fully understand what Mia was going through, and the guilt of not doing enough to ease her pain gnawed at him. His protective instincts kicked in, and he realized that he needed to do something to show Mia that he truly cared, that his feelings for her went beyond what the world saw on the surface. In a bold move, Damien stood before the high-profile guests and publicly defended Mia, rejecting Clara's insinuations. He made it clear, without saying a word, that Mia was not just a charity case to him. His gesture was a raw moment of vulnerability that caught everyone off guard, including Mia. Mia was taken aback by the public display. She hadn't expected Damien to take such a stand on her behalf, and it stirred something within her. Part of her felt touched, seeing that he was willing to risk his reputation and his image to protect her. Yet, another part of her was conflicted. Was this genuine, or was it just another attempt to repair his image in the eyes of the public? The public's reaction was mixed. Some saw it as an act of redemption, others as a calculated move to win favor. For Mia, it was yet another reminder of how much she didn't belong in this world, and the emotional distance between her and Damien only widened. She couldn't tell if his feelings for her were real, or if he was simply playing a game with her emotions. As the days passed after the charity event, the tension between Mia and Damien continued to grow. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that Damien's gesture, though kind, had only deepened her inner conflict. The more she thought about it, the more she questioned his motivations. Was he truly defending her because he cared, or was it a calculated move to avoid any public backlash? She knew he had his own demons to contend with, and his emotional distance had always made it hard for her to trust his actions. Even though the public had seen it as a grand gesture, for Mia, it felt like yet another instance of being caught in a world where she didn't quite belong. Damien, on the other hand, began to realize just how deeply the charity event had affected Mia. He could see the walls growing higher between them, and it frustrated him. He had made the decision to defend her, not because he wanted to prove something to the world, but because he genuinely cared for her and didn't want to see her hurt. But somehow Mia wasn't seeing it that way. His emotions were in turmoil. He knew Mia was a strong, independent woman, and that she resented the idea of being pitted. But he couldn't deny the growing affection he felt for her. It was becoming harder for him to compartmentalize his feelings. He didn't know how to reach her, how to get past the emotional wall she had erected especially when his own walls were still so firmly in place. The cracks in their relationship began to show, and the strain of their external world started to seep into their private lives. Clara's presence continued to loom over them, and she seemed to be a constant, destructive force in their lives. Her manipulations became more apparent as she found new ways to subtly undermine Mia and create doubts in Damien's mind. Clara's jealousy over Damien's growing bond with Mia was becoming unbearable, and she used every opportunity to drive a wedge between them. She would often use her influence in Damien's business dealings to put pressure on Mia, questioning her qualifications and subtly threatening her position in the company. Despite Damien's assurances that he would protect her, Mia couldn't ignore the growing sense that Clara's power and manipulation were becoming more entrenched. It wasn't just the business pressure that was mounting. Clara was also targeting Mia on a more personal level. She would often show up uninvited at events and meetings, using her charm and calculated moves to make Mia feel like an outsider. Her passive-aggressive comments and insinuations about Mia's place in Damien's life were starting to take a toll. Mia, once so confident and assertive, began to feel the weight of Clara's presence more acutely. She had never wanted to be a part of this high-society world, but now it felt like Clara was slowly chipping away at whatever ground she had gained. The emotional toll of Clara's manipulations started to wear Mia down. She felt cornered, unsure of who she could trust. Damien's defenses of her, though meaningful, weren't enough to protect her from the calculated games Clara was playing. Mia's self-doubt resurfaced with a vengeance. She started to wonder if she had any place in Damien's world, or if she was just a pawn in a larger game. She could see the subtle shifts in Damien's behavior, the way he would withdraw into himself when things got too difficult. His attempts to protect her felt inadequate, as though he was trying to maintain control over his life while still trying to shield her from the fallout. But it wasn't enough, and Mia began to fear that, despite everything, she might never truly be free of the looming presence of Clara, or of Damien's expectations. Damien, meanwhile, was facing his own battle. As much as he wanted to shield Mia from Clara's cruel games, he knew that doing so was slowly pulling him away from the person he had been, someone who could keep his emotions in check and maintain control at all costs. The more Mia struggled, the more he found himself at a crossroads. On one hand, he wanted to protect her, but on the other hand, he feared losing the stability of his carefully constructed life. He couldn't shake the guilt of putting her in this position to begin with. His world had never been kind to anyone who wasn't part of the elite, and now Mia was being dragged into a battle she hadn't signed up for. He began to question whether he was doing enough for her, or if he was inadvertently becoming a source of her pain rather than her salvation. The stakes became even higher when Clara started to make more aggressive moves. She used her connections to create subtle obstacles for both Mia and Damien, putting pressure on their business dealings and personal lives. Mia was increasingly caught in the crossfire, and it wasn't long before the effects of Clara's actions began to show. At first, it was small things, a slight change in the way people at the office looked at her, the way certain opportunities were being blocked, but soon the stakes grew higher. Clara's influence over Damien's business and social circles was undeniable, and Mia found herself wondering if she could ever truly be a part of Damien's world without being overshadowed by Clara's malicious presence. The pressure from all sides began to mount, and Mia found herself at a breaking point. She knew she couldn't continue to allow herself to be manipulated, but she also didn't want to become a burden to Damien. She had never been one to sit idly by while someone else fought her battles. She wanted to stand on her own 2 feet, to prove that she could carve out her own path without relying on anyone else. But that path was increasingly difficult to find as Clara's manipulations continued to chip away at her confidence. It wasn't long before Mia began to take matters into her own hands. She started to assert herself more, refusing to let Clara walk all over her. She sought advice from trusted friends who helped her regain her sense of self-worth. Mia began to recognize her own strength, realizing that she didn't need Damien's protection to survive. She could stand up for herself and take control of her own destiny, even if that meant facing Clara head-on. It was a difficult, painful process, but Mia knew it was the only way to regain her sense of agency and fight for the life she wanted. As the external pressures continued to mount, The relationship between Mia and Damien began to strain even further. Both were facing their own internal struggles, and the growing influence of Clara threatened to tear them apart. Mia's fear of being controlled and used by Damien began to clash with his own fear of losing control over his life. The once strong bond between them now felt fragile, and both of them were forced to confront the realities of their situation. Would they be able to weather the storm of external forces, or would the weight of their own fears and insecurities tear them apart forever? Only time would tell if they could overcome the rising tensions and find a way to protect their relationship amidst the chaos. The tension between Mia and Damien reached new heights as the days wore on. With Clara's presence becoming a constant threat to their relationship, both of them found themselves consumed by their own fears and doubts. Mia, though she had started to assert herself more, couldn't escape the feeling that she was being torn between two conflicting worlds. The life Damien had offered her, a life of comfort and stability, was at odds with the powerful pull of her independence. Every time she stood up for herself, she felt as though she was pushing Damien further away. Yet, the more she realized how dependent she was on him, the more resentful she became of that very dependence. Damien, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly desperate to keep Mia from slipping away. His growing feelings for her had forced him to confront his own limitations, and he found himself constantly battling the urge to retreat behind his emotional walls. He had worked so hard to build his empire, to maintain control, but with Mia in his life, everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He hated the vulnerability that came with caring for someone, especially someone like Mia, who had always managed to stay one step ahead of him. The more he tried to protect her from the world, the more he felt like he was suffocating her. His love for her was a double-edged sword. He didn't want to lose her, but he also feared that his involvement in her life would only make things worse. Clara's machinations grew more insidious as time went on. Every move she made seemed designed to undermine Mia, to make her feel as though she didn't belong in Damien's world. It wasn't enough for Clara to challenge Damien professionally. She was now taking aim at Mia personally. Her words were like daggers, constantly chipping away at Mia's self-esteem. At the charity event, she had called Mia a charity case, a term that continued to echo in Mia's mind, poisoning her perception of herself. Despite Damien's attempt to defend her, Mia felt more exposed than ever. Clara's cruel commentary echoed in her thoughts, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable reality that she might never truly fit into the world Damien inhabited. The increasing frequency of Clara's appearances at events and business functions made it difficult for Mia to feel secure in her place. She couldn't help but feel like an outsider, a distraction in a world that didn't truly want her. She had never asked for any of this, yet here she was, caught in the middle of a battle that felt like it was spiraling beyond her control. As Clara continued to manipulate situations to her advantage, Mia began to question her own worth. Was she simply a project to Damien, a charity case he had taken pity on? She had been struggling with her own sense of identity since moving into Damien's world, but Clara's actions forced her to confront these feelings with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, Damien was becoming increasingly aware of the emotional toll the situation was taking on Mia. He saw the signs, the way she withdrew, the way her confidence faltered, and the way she seemed to be constantly battling her own sense of inadequacy. It broke his heart to see her like this, but he wasn't sure how to fix it. Every attempt he made to shield her seemed to make matters worse, and he found himself caught in an impossible situation. Clara was relentless, and her presence in their lives seemed to be a constant reminder of the fragility of their relationship. He wanted to fight back, to stand up to Clara and protect Mia, but the stakes were too high. His business, his family legacy, all of it was on the line, and he couldn't afford to make a misstep. But he couldn't help but feel that his own inaction was hurting Mia, forcing her to bear the brunt of Clara's manipulations. The pressure of the situation began to wear on both of them. Mia found herself grappling with a deepening sense of frustration. She no longer wanted to be the woman caught in the middle of Damien's complicated life. She was tired of feeling like she was dependent on him, but she also couldn't ignore the fact that she had no other options. The job at his company provided her with a stability she could never have imagined, and it gave her a future she hadn't thought possible. But the cost of that stability, her independence, was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Mia was torn between her gratitude for what Damien had offered her and her resentment for the power dynamic that kept her in a position of weakness. Damien, too, found himself at a breaking point. His feelings for Mia were undeniable, but the more he tried to protect her, the more it seemed like he was losing control of his own life. He had always been in control, always kept a tight grip on everything, but with Mia in his life, he was starting to question everything he thought he knew. His past had taught him to keep his emotions in check, to avoid becoming vulnerable, but Mia had found a way past those walls. He felt something for her, something deep and real, but he wasn't sure if he could allow himself to feel it fully. He didn't know how to reconcile his desire to protect her with the growing realization that their relationship was becoming increasingly fragile. As the weeks passed, both of them struggled to navigate the shifting dynamics of their relationship. Mia began to take more control over her own life, refusing to let Clara manipulate her any longer. She sought out her own support, finding strength in her independence. But that didn't mean the tension between her and Damien had dissipated. If anything, it had grown more intense. Damien's emotional walls remained as high as ever, and Mia's sense of uncertainty had only deepened. Both of them were trapped in a cycle of emotional tension, with neither one fully able to break free from the forces that threatened to tear them apart. In the end, the external pressures, Clara's manipulation, the public scrutiny, the weight of their respective pasts, began to feel like an insurmountable obstacle. Their relationship was strained to its breaking point, with both of them unsure if they could weather the storm. Mia feared that, despite everything, she would never be more than a pawn in a game she never asked to play. Damien, on the other hand, feared that his need to protect her would eventually push her away. The once promising connection between them now seemed fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. And neither of them knew if they could survive the storm, together or apart. The weight of Mia's emotions had been building for months, but it wasn't until the pressure of her pregnancy, the unresolved trauma of her past, and the increasing strain of her uncertain future all collided that she finally reached her breaking point. The panic attack came suddenly, violently, as Mia felt her chest tighten, her thoughts racing, and the world around her spinning out of control. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. Overcome by the intensity of it all, Mia ran to Damien's office, desperate for some form of refuge, as if the space where he worked could offer a momentary escape from the storm raging inside her. This was a new low for her, a raw admission that she couldn't keep running from herself any longer. In the sterile, clean lines of his office, she crumbled, emotionally exhausted and terrified by the sheer magnitude of her vulnerability. Damien's presence, once a source of comfort, felt distant now as her body betrayed her, shaking uncontrollably in front of him. For the first time in their complicated relationship, Damien saw her, really saw her, not as someone to fix or protect, but as someone deeply broken. He stepped out of his usual emotionally distant shell, his innate detachment crumbling in the face of her pain. He didn't know how to handle this, didn't know what to say, but he knew he had to be there. In that moment, Damien allowed himself to be vulnerable, offering Mia his full, undivided attention. He held her, steady and firm, as she struggled to regain control of her breath. It was the first time that Mia felt as though someone understood the full scope of her suffering, not just the surface-level issues that had defined her relationship with Damien up until now. He didn't try to fix her. Instead, he simply listened, offering what comfort he could in the silence. This act of emotional support was foreign to both of them, but it marked a significant shift in their dynamic, bringing them closer than they had ever been before. In the quiet intimacy of that moment, something changed between them, and it wasn't just Mia's understanding of Damien's capacity for care. It was her own internal shift. For the first time, she began to recognize that she didn't have to carry this burden alone. After the panic attack, Mia found herself faced with the stark reality of her trauma. She couldn't deny it any longer. The pain from her past was still a part of her, lingering beneath the surface, influencing every decision she made and every relationship she formed. The fear of being abandoned, the feelings of inadequacy that had been instilled in her from an early age, and the scars left by emotional neglect had all combined to create a person who was perpetually on the defensive, afraid of being hurt again. But now, in the aftermath of her emotional collapse, Mia could no longer continue to run from that truth. The realization hit her like a wave. She had been pushing her pain aside for too long, trying to keep moving forward without ever confronting the trauma that had shaped her. This was the moment when she knew she had to stop surviving and start healing. Slowly, she began to accept that she couldn't just bury her past any longer. The first step toward healing was facing it head-on, acknowledging the damage it had caused and understanding how it had held her back. She had spent so long living in survival mode that she had lost sight of what it meant to thrive, to truly live her life instead of merely enduring it. The process would be painful, but Mia understood that this was the only way forward. Damien, too, found himself at a crossroads. After their intimate exchange, he began to see Mia in a new light. The woman who had been strong, independent, and resilient was also deeply fragile, carrying with her a burden he couldn't fully comprehend. He had been so focused on his own struggles and his need to maintain control that he had failed to see how much Mia had been suffering. When he proposed a partnership to her, offering her a position in his company as an equal, it wasn't just a professional move. It was a gesture of deep trust and vulnerability. He was extending a hand to her, not just as his assistant, but as someone he genuinely respected and cared for. It was his way of showing her that he saw her as more than a charity case, more than someone to be rescued. This offer was a chance for Mia to reclaim her independence, to build something for herself beyond the confines of their complicated relationship. But Mia, still grappling with the pain of her past and the fear of losing herself in Damien's world, struggled with the offer. She couldn't help but question his motives. Was this truly a chance for growth? Or was it just another way for Damien to subtly control her life? The fear of being manipulated resurfaced, and Mia found herself torn between the opportunity to build a future for herself and the anxiety of losing the autonomy she had fought so hard to maintain. As she wrestled with the decision, Clara's betrayal struck like a thunderclap. She had always been a thorn in their relationship, but this was different. Clara, with her cold, calculating nature, had orchestrated a campaign to destroy Mia's credibility, leaking sensitive details about her traumatic past to the press. The world learned about Mia's history of abandonment and abuse, and Clara made sure that every headline cast doubt on Mia's worth and intentions. The public exposure of her most painful memories left Mia feeling raw and exposed. It wasn't just her past that had been laid bare. It was her deepest fears, her vulnerability, the things she had worked so hard to protect. The betrayal cut deep, and for a moment, Mia wanted to retreat completely, to disappear from the world that now seemed to reject her. Her relationship with Damien, once a source of refuge, now felt like a painful reminder of everything she had tried to escape. How could she trust him or anyone when her past had been weaponized against her? Damien, caught between his loyalty to Mia and the pressure from his family and business interests, found himself at a crossroads. Clara's actions had put him in an impossible position. He could stand by Mia, defend her, and risk alienating the very people who had supported him for years, or he could distance himself from her and protect his own interests. The choice was agonizing. For the first time in a long while, Damien had to confront his own fears, not just of vulnerability, but of losing everything he had built. But in the end, his love for Mia won out. He couldn't let her face this alone, not after everything they had shared. Damien made a bold decision to publicly stand by her side, confronting Clara and declaring his support for Mia. He showed the world that his feelings for her were real, that he was willing to sacrifice everything for their relationship. This act of courage, of standing up for Mia despite the risks, marked a turning point for Damien. It was a moment of true emotional vulnerability, and it signaled his transformation from the emotionally distant CEO he had once been to a man capable of deep, authentic connection. Mia, though still reeling from the betrayal and the public exposure of her pain, began to rebuild herself in the wake of these events. She didn't need Damien to define her. She didn't need anyone to validate her worth. The process of healing was slow, but it was real. As the wounds from her past began to heal, Mia realized that she had the strength to face whatever came next, whether that meant continuing her partnership with Damien or stepping out on her own. For the first time, she felt a sense of empowerment, not because of her relationship with Damien, but because of her own ability to navigate the challenges of her life. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer afraid of the future. She had faced her past, and now she was ready to shape her own destiny. The decision about her future, about her relationship with Damien, would come in time, but for now, Mia was focused on the most important thing, herself. As Mia worked through the aftermath of the betrayal, Damien's unwavering support began to mean more to her than she had anticipated. His public stand for her had removed any lingering doubts she had about his sincerity. But even as she felt the warmth of his love, she still found herself grappling with the damage done by Clara's campaign and the weight of her own fears. The wounds of her past had been reopened, and now they felt like a permanent part of her. She knew she couldn't outrun them, but she was learning to live with them, step by step. Each day was a struggle, but Mia was determined not to let her past define her future. She focused on her own growth, slowly rebuilding her sense of self-worth and confidence, refusing to let anyone, even Clara, control her narrative. In the midst of this internal battle, Mia found herself at a crossroads when it came to her relationship with Damien. Though she could feel the love between them, the scars from their past, both hers and his, were hard to ignore. She could sense that Damien was still wrestling with his own emotional walls, still struggling with the need to protect himself from vulnerability. His decision to defend her publicly had been a monumental gesture, but Mia knew that there was more beneath the surface that he had yet to confront. She could feel the distance between them at times, like a lingering presence that neither of them could completely ignore. She loved him, but she couldn't ignore the fact that he had his own demons to face. Damien, too, found himself in a delicate position. As Mia's emotional retreat deepened, he felt a sense of helplessness that he hadn't expected. He had never been one to open up easily, and the vulnerability that came with their shared emotional moments made him feel exposed in a way that he wasn't accustomed to. His fear of being hurt again, of losing control, had always been a barrier in his relationships, and now he saw how it was affecting his connection with Mia. He knew that he had to face his own fears if he wanted to truly be with her, but the thought of dismantling the walls he had spent years building was terrifying. Despite the love he felt for Mia, he couldn't help but wonder if he was capable of truly opening his heart to her, or if he was doomed to repeat the same patterns of emotional distance that had defined his life until now. Their relationship was in crisis, and they both knew it. The tension between them, while not as overt as Clara's manipulations, was undeniable. Both of them had so much to give, but they had yet to fully let go of their pasts, and that was creating a divide between them. Mia wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that they could build something real together, but she couldn't ignore the fear that her past might always come back to haunt her. And Damien, despite his love for her, couldn't ignore the fear that his own emotional walls might ultimately push her away. They were at an impasse, each of them trapped in their own emotional turmoil, and neither knew how to move forward. But just as it seemed like they might be on the brink of losing everything, something changed. Mia, recognizing that her own healing was the key to moving forward, made a decision. She chose to trust Damien, not just with her heart, but with her future. She knew that no one could truly heal on their own, that they needed to face their struggles together. And for the first time, she was willing to be vulnerable with him. She stopped running from the pain of her past and allowed herself to be open to the possibility of a future with Damien. This was her moment of rebirth, of embracing the healing that could only come through love and trust. Damien, too, found the courage to take a risk. Seeing Mia's willingness to open herself up to him, he realized that he could no longer let his own fears dictate the course of his life. He had to confront the emotional walls that had defined his existence and let them crumble. He knew that Mia was worth the risk, that she deserved someone who could give her everything, emotionally, mentally, and physically. So, for the first time, Damien allowed himself to be completely vulnerable, to admit that he was scared of losing her, scared of what it meant to let go of the control that had always kept him safe. But he also knew that it was the only way to truly be with her, to build something real and lasting. In this moment of mutual vulnerability, Mia and Damien found their way back to each other. It wasn't easy, and there were still hurdles to overcome, but for the first time, they both understood what it meant to love and to heal together. They had both faced their darkest fears and come out stronger on the other side. Mia no longer feared her past, and Damien no longer feared his own emotions. Together, they had found a way to move forward, not as two broken people, but as two people who had learned to embrace their flaws and their wounds in order to build something beautiful. Their journey wasn't over, but they had found a new chapter, one where love, trust, and vulnerability could flourish. In the end, Mia's decision to trust Damien was the turning point for both of them. It wasn't just about accepting his love, it was about accepting herself, flaws and all. Damien's willingness to let go of his emotional walls and embrace vulnerability was just as significant. Together, they had crossed the threshold into a new phase of their relationship, one where they could finally heal and grow, both as individuals and as partners. Their love was no longer defined by their pasts, but by the hope and strength they had found in each other. As the days passed, Mia and Damien continued to rebuild the foundation of their relationship, one that had been tested by external forces and internal struggles. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but they both found solace in the shared commitment to each other. Mia, once consumed by her past and the fear of being used or abandoned, was slowly learning to trust not just Damien, but herself as well. She started to see herself not as a victim of her circumstances, but as a woman capable of overcoming the challenges life had thrown her way. Her inner strength, once buried beneath layers of fear and insecurity, began to surface in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every day, Mia took another step forward, no longer bound by the trauma of her past, but empowered by the love and support she now felt from Damien. Damien, too, found himself evolving. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart began to crumble with every vulnerable conversation, every act of genuine connection he shared with Mia. For the first time in his life, he was allowing someone to see him fully, his flaws, his fears, and his desires. The experience was liberating in a way he hadn't expected. Damien began to realize that his workaholic tendencies and emotional detachment had been coping mechanisms, ways of avoiding the pain of vulnerability. But Mia had shown him that true strength came from the willingness to be open and emotionally present. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning to be the man Mia needed him to be, and more importantly, the man he needed to be for himself. Despite the progress they had made, challenges still lingered, particularly from Clara. Though Damien had confronted her in the most public way possible, her obsession with him remained unshaken. Clara's manipulations were more subtle now, but she was still a formidable presence in both his personal and professional life. She had tried to undermine him at every turn, and though she had failed to break them apart, her influence was far-reaching. She wasn't one to back down easily, and Damien knew that she wouldn't stop until she had torn everything apart. Still, Damien refused to let her dictate the course of his life any longer. He had made a choice, and that choice was Mia. The decision to fight for their relationship wasn't just a passing moment of resolve. It was a commitment to the life he wanted to build with her, free from the toxic pull of his past. Mia, while still grappling with the exposure of her painful history, had found an inner peace that was once foreign to her. She had realized that her past, though dark and full of scars, didn't define who she was. It was a part of her story, but it didn't have to control her future. With Damien's support, she began to embrace the possibility of a new chapter in her life, one where she was in control of her destiny. The wounds of her past were still there, but they no longer held power over her. She had become her own source of strength, And while Damien's love played a crucial role in her healing, she understood that her journey was her own to navigate. As the weeks turned into months, Mia and Damien began to see the fruits of their efforts. The trust they had built, piece by piece, began to flourish into something deeper, more secure. The fears that had once loomed over their relationship, Mia's fear of being abandoned and Damien's fear of being vulnerable, no longer had the same power over them. They had faced their individual demons and found that together, they were stronger. Damien had transformed from the emotionally distant CEO to a man who understood the true meaning of partnership, while Mia had found her voice and her independence in a relationship that allowed her to grow. Their shared journey wasn't without its setbacks, but every challenge they overcame made them more resilient. The more they learned about each other, the more they understood that love wasn't about perfection. It was about accepting one another's flaws and vulnerabilities. Mia wasn't perfect, but neither was Damien. They both had scars from their pasts, but they also had the potential to build something lasting and beautiful. In the end, the greatest triumph for both of them wasn't just surviving the storm, but emerging from it stronger and more connected than ever before. Their love, once complicated by insecurities and fears, had blossomed into something real and profound. Mia had reclaimed her independence, not just as a woman, but as an equal partner in their relationship. And Damien, no longer trapped by the emotional walls he had built, was able to offer Mia not just love, but true emotional support and vulnerability. Together, they had learned that love wasn't a one-sided act of charity, but a shared, transformative experience that required both giving and receiving. With their foundation stronger than ever, Mia and Damien stood on the precipice of a new beginning. The future was uncertain, but they had proven to themselves and to each other that no challenge was too great for them to face together. The love they had fought so hard to build was no longer fragile. It was resilient, capable of withstanding anything life might throw their way. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that whatever obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger than they had ever been before. Mia had grown immeasurably in the months following the chaos and heartbreak of her past. It wasn't just the emotional support of Damien that had helped her heal. It was the introspective journey she embarked on, one that required her to delve deep into the very core of who she was. With every challenge she faced, Mia grew more empowered, more confident in her ability to chart her own course. The scars from her past no longer haunted her in the same way. Instead, they became the stepping stones that led her toward a future she could now see clearly. She began to embrace her resilience, understanding that her value was not defined by others or by her past experiences. It was rooted in her strength, her capacity to endure, and the person she had become through the trials she had overcome. Damien, on the other hand, found himself in a battle of his own. His emotional walls, built over a lifetime of neglect and self-preservation, were slowly starting to crumble. At first, he resisted the idea of confronting his emotional vulnerability. It had always seemed like a weakness to him, something to be avoided at all costs. But as he spent more time reflecting on his relationship with Mia and the pain of losing her, he began to realize that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was the key to authentic connection. He understood for the first time that his relationship with Mia wasn't about charity or duty. It was about love, real and unshakable. His journey toward emotional awakening was slow but steady, and with every step forward, he grew more open to the possibility of true intimacy. Damien faced his fear of connection and took responsibility for the walls he had put up, gradually learning how to dismantle them in order to build something real and lasting with Mia. The day Mia and Damien crossed paths again, it was clear that both had changed. There was no longer the imbalance of power that had characterized their earlier interactions. Instead, their dynamic had evolved into something grounded in mutual respect and understanding. They were no longer a man in a position of power and a woman in need of rescue. They were equals, both with their own fears, dreams, and desires. The tension between them had dissipated, replaced by open communication and emotional honesty. In each other, they had found not just partners in love, but partners in life. They could now speak candidly about their aspirations and the challenges they faced, sharing their thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment or rejection. Their relationship had transformed from one of dependency to one of strength, with both of them contributing equally to the connection they now shared. Mia's triumph was evident in the bold steps she took to carve out her own future. She had always been driven, but now she was working with purpose and conviction, fueled by a deep desire to create something meaningful, not just for herself, but for others. She started her own business, dedicated to supporting women who had faced hardships similar to her own. It was a labor of love, born from the lessons she had learned throughout her own journey. With hard work and determination, Mia's business began to grow, and with each small success, her confidence grew. She realized that her worth wasn't tied to any man's validation, but to her own resilience and her ability to create a life that reflected her ambitions. She had stepped in her own power, and no matter what the future held, Mia knew she had the strength to face it. Damien's support for Mia's new endeavor was unwavering, but not in the way it had once been. This time, he wasn't trying to control her or steer her in a direction he thought was best. He saw her independence and strength for what they were, remarkable qualities that deserved to be nurtured. As a true partner, he offered his expertise and resources, not as a way to dominate or direct her, but to help her achieve her goals in a way that felt true to her vision. Together, they built a partnership that wasn't just professional, but deeply personal. Damien respected Mia's autonomy, and in turn, she welcomed his support without hesitation, knowing that their relationship was rooted in trust, respect, and love. They were no longer two people trying to save each other, but two individuals who had grown and healed, now walking alongside each other as equals. The culmination of their individual journeys led to a new beginning, one where both of them had healed from the wounds of the past and were ready to embark on a future together. Their relationship, once fraught with insecurities and misunderstandings, had blossomed into something deep and unwavering. Mia and Damien had faced the challenges of their pasts, had grown emotionally, and had come to understand the true meaning of partnership. They were no longer held back by the trauma of their respective histories, but were free to build a future based on the love and respect they had for each other. Their vision for the future was shared, their goals aligned, and they moved forward not as individuals, but as a united team. In the final moments of their journey, Mia and Damien found closure. They let go of the guilt and shame that had once defined them, embracing the healing that had come from their struggles. The emotional baggage that had weighed them down for so long had been released, and they stood together, stronger than ever before. The past no longer held them captive. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far they had come. Mia, once consumed by fear and doubt, had found her place in the world, and Damien, no longer afraid to be vulnerable, had found his own sense of peace. Together, they faced the future with hope, knowing that the challenges they had faced had only made them more resilient, more capable, and more united than ever. The journey had been long and difficult, but in the end, Mia and Damien had found the redemption and healing they both so desperately needed. Their love, built on trust and mutual respect, was the foundation upon which they would build their future, a future they would face together, hand in hand.